caught me listening to some streaming music. It's Professor Coquinos for AC171. We're going to talk today about radio, recording, and popular music. So, a little bit about the history of radio, right? The airwaves. How did they get to the point where they were transmitting signals over the air? Well, a couple of people were experimenting around, but one of the key figures was Guglielmo Marconi, who successfully transmitted a Morse code signal. A little later on, Lee DeForest invented the Audion tube, which also allowed you to present radio transmissions from point to point. In sound recording, Thomas Edison invented a talking machine that was able to record your voice over a wax disc. Emil Berliner later developed a metal disc gramophone that was more reliable. And in 1905, Columbia Phonograph Company introduced a two-sided disc that you would play one side and then have a B-side to turn over. Well, right before World War I, everybody was going crazy, trying to, transmit signals over the air. It was kind of like chaos. Everybody was like stepping on everybody else's signals, and the government decided that it was going to take over all the patents until the end of the war and control them. And obviously, they needed to be able to communicate during wartime. After the disaster of the Titanic, there were regulations that made it imperative that every ship had an operator on board who could run the radio. In 1927, the United States instituted the Radio Act of 1927, which included the Federal Radio Commission. And this used a trustee model. The idea was that no one owned the airwaves. Just like we're keepers of the earth, the people who had radio stations were keepers of the airwaves. And there was only so much bandwidth, as there is today, that signals could be broadcasted on. Later, that Radio Act was supplemented by the Communications Act of 1934, and that instituted the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, which is still the governing body today. As radio grew, many networks had affiliates. So an affiliate was someone who could just take the programming that the network provided. Excuse me. It was certainly easier. You didn't have to produce your own programming, which was expensive. Plus, you could get high quality programming from the network and have greater reach and greater advertising. You couldn't afford the big radio stars, so if you were an affiliate, you could have the network programming for you. And there were some big networks around. NBC, Red, Blue, and CBS, and the Mutual Network. All were around in the United States, and they had their affiliates. So the idea of government regulation was that it was based on the public interest. So radio stations broadcast in the public interest, and they still do that today. They still have to show that they play a certain amount of public news or public service announcements for supporting people and letting people know critical information. There are certain times in radio that are critical too. Today it's those drive times, right? Most people listen to the radio in their cars. So the morning drive and the afternoon drive coming home are the critical times when radio advertisers can catch people. The whole golden age of radio. So the idea of kind of like these radio dramas where, people would be in the studio doing, a kind of drama with sound effects. And the famous one was Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. And supposedly it was so real, even though they made an announcement that it was fake, people really thought that we were being invaded by Martians. And they were kind of panicking over it. At this time, you also had two types of vinyl discs. You had the 33 and a third rotations per minute, and then you had the 45, which was a smaller disc that could only have about 3 minutes on it. The 33 could have about 22 minutes on it. So 33s were really for like classical music and longer pieces, and the 45s became pop. Then we had the advent of television, and this really killed radio. You know, this term, video killed the radio star. So at first, radio dropped a lot because no one wanted to sit there and watch their radio when they could watch television. So a lot of programmers lost their listeners in radio. So radio had to do something. What do you think they did? Well, it became much more kind of niche oriented and focusing on formats. So you had talk formats, and then you had music formats and news. So the idea was that you could catch people at certain times. Most people listen to radio when they're doing other things. So like I said, driving to work, you might listen to radio. Maybe you're working, you're doing something that requires your attention. You can't be watching TV or looking at your phone. Of course, you weren't looking at your phone in those days, but the idea was that radio was a great background. So here's the radio reach, and you can see that it's about steady depending on the age groups. Younger people listen a little bit less. Here we have the beginnings of public radio. So the idea of low power radio stations and national public radio, which is a network that has their affiliates all over, and they get news from all those affiliates and put together a news show that they then re-release. And there's all kinds of other great programming, like All Songs Considered, one of my favorite shows on NPR to find out about new music. All those public formats were pushed down to the lower end of the dial from 88.1 to 91.9. And that's where they still are today. So down at the bottom of the dial in FM, you have all of the public radio stations that are commercial free. They generally get their funding from underwriters and from listener support and also from the government. Another interesting infographic here showing you the popular formats in radio. And obviously there are lots of different tastes in music, so depending on regional areas, you have all different kinds of music formats. So radio is this kind of medium that can be very localized. You might hear commercials about your hometown where it's extremely localized in rural areas. And very personal, right? Here I am with my headphones on. I don't think I need my headphones anymore, but the idea that, the DJ is talking right to me. It's a very personalized format. Although it's one of the first mass media, it could be really perceived as being very personalized. So many stations with specialized formats, and the other thing was that transistors made the radios much smaller so that you could take it with you, and you could have your radio anywhere. So here's the graph showing you different formats and what people listen to, mostly still AM and FM, but other areas are growing. Satellite radio, owned music, music that you download, online audio, podcasts, which are growing. This is probably an outdated figure. Okay, and the idea of radio as an advertising medium, depending on how many people you can reach in your area, you would have a rating, which would also determine how expensive it was to advertise. So obviously radio stations that reach a lot of people, they could charge more for their advertising time. Okay, Arbitron is the king of radio, charting and getting an idea of the ratings. Early on in the 50s, a lot of black musicians were making a lot of great music, and unfortunately, a lot of radio stations wouldn't play it. They would play white covers, though, of those songs. So a lot of radio stations were looking for someone who could be white but sing black, and Elvis Presley was one of the famous people who kind of fit that bill. Today we have very different things going on, and with computers and automation and artificial intelligence, in a lot of ways things have become very homogenized. A hit record might be a formula where a computer can kind of drive an algorithm, and then someone would listen to it and write some lyrics, and it's almost it's going to be a smash hit right away, especially if you can get a popular person to sing it. If you look at a lot of popular songs today, they are written this way. Okay, here are some of the best selling radio artists. Lots of classic rock from my era. MTV is definitely credited with changing the whole landscape of the music industry, the advertising industry. And they came on in 1981, and with the music video, all of a sudden other things started looking like music videos. Commercials started looking like music videos. Films started using a lot more sound, and then having soundtracks. So everybody was jumping on the popular music kind of bandwagon. Syndication is another thing where I would produce a show and then it could be syndicated all over. So I could sell it to various affiliates, and again, like a small station could pick up a well-known syndicated show like Ryan Seacrest or Rush Limbaugh, and they would be able to, again, attract audience and attract advertisers from that. Most cars today are outfitted with satellite radios so that you can receive digital music in your car wherever you are. In terrestrial digital radio, you might have like a high definition station, and this actually allows not only better quality, but it also allows for multiple channels. So you could have, HD1 and HD2, where you might have some different programming on each one, but it's still the same radio station with the same signal. I remember getting my first Walkman, the Sony Walkman, with a cassette in there, and kind of weird foamy headphones. And of course today, you guys listen on this. So Apple and stopped making their iPod, and everybody started moving over to using their smartphones. So here's how most of us today, well actually in 2020, listen to music. And it's mostly streaming, with the least of it being vinyl records. I mean, there's a small niche of people who like the sound of vinyl, so it has this retro kind of comeback feel to it. And it does have a warmer quality. I don't know if you know anybody who actually has an old school stereo with the big speakers and the turntable going round and round. It has a certain warmth, that analog warmth, that can't really be duplicated by digital. A lot of industry formats were around, but the MP3 was the one that really held up. It's not the best quality, but it was a small package and it was able to be distributed very easily. So a lot of music today is still MP3. So if you're downloading something from Apple iTunes, it's probably going to be in that MP3 format. Of course, the CD was introduced in 1983, became popular in the 90s really, and then now it's kind of fizzled out. Napster was a kind of file sharing association where people would share all kinds of files, but mainly music. And it was piracy, it was really illegal, and the record companies weren't happy because they were losing a lot of money on it. And then the idea of you are what you listen to. What's on your phone? What do you listen to? How do you get your music? Do you listen to playlists? A lot of music services like Pandora use this organic kind of algorithm. So if you like a certain band, let's say you listen to Cardi B, then it'll suggest other artists, Lord or whatever, so that you'll kind of be fed a certain genre or a certain playlist. But does that really give you the diversity that you need or that you should have? So my challenge to you is to think about how you get your music and what places can you get really unique music. For instance, do you know what klezmer music is? Do you know what Americana is? And if you don't explore things like this, then you'll never open up your musical horizons. So one of my assignments for you is to try to open that musical horizon and open your ears to some new sounds.